Judging in the UFC has been one of the sport's most pressing issues, as some of these judges' decisions have been regarded as daylight robbery by a lot of fighters and fans alike. UFC President Dana White has even said, "Never leave it in the hands of the judges," words that have been immortalized in locker room doors. Even though most times it's just as easy for fans and fighters to scream foul when the decision doesn't go their way, these 10 judges' decisions in this video are bouts where the fighters were robbed for real. Without further ado, let's get into it. Don't forget to like and subscribe to keep getting intriguing UFC content. Number 10. Demetrious Johnson versus Ian McCall. The fight between Demetrious Johnson and then top-ranked 125-pounder Ian McCall, unfortunately, proved to be one of the most controversial decisions of all time. The first and second rounds were too tight to call, with both men scoring with impressive takedowns and landing fairly evenly in the striking department. The consensus seemed to be round 1 for McCall and round 2 for Johnson. The third round, however, was simple. McCall totally dominated Johnson, eventually finding himself in the back mount position, where he rained down hard shots that could have seen the fight stopped. 9-28 win if it was a 10-9. However, two of the judges somehow scored the fight 29-28 for Johnson, giving him a split decision victory. If that wasn't bad enough, when the scorecards were later checked, it turned out someone's math had been bad, as while one judge had indeed gone 29-28 for Johnson, the other two had gone 29-29 and 28-28 respectively, meaning it was a majority draw. And by the rules of the flyweight tournament, the fight should have gone to an overtime round, which McCall would have had a huge advantage in. Instead, the UFC was forced to redo the fight 3 months later, and Johnson made the better adjustments and picked up a clear-cut win.
So quick. Sudden victory round scenario in place.
McCall's UFC career was never the same afterward, and the whole thing left a sour taste in his mouth. Imagine how different the flyweight division could have been had the judges made the right call. Number 9. Lyoto Machida versus Mauricio Hua. Going into UFC 104, all the hype was on Lyoto Machida, who had been crowned UFC light heavyweight champion 5 months prior. At that point, nobody had been able to figure out his karate-based style. And he was massively favored to beat former Pride champion Shogun Rua, who had been given a title shot based on his reputation and a win over a much-diminished Chuck Liddell. As Shogun hadn't shown anything close to his Pride form in the UFC, most fans were expecting a Machida whitewash. Instead, they were stunned as Hua cracked the code and found a way to hurt the Dragon. Rather than attempt to hit him in the face, he instead focused all of his attacks on the body and legs, both hurting Machida and also hampering his movement, which led to his success. Both men took some hard shots in what turned out to be a great fight.
9th time we have had a rematch. Sin Silva, Vitor Belfort, Murillo Bustamante, Minotauro Nogueira.
But when all was said and done, it appeared that Shogun's body and leg work would be enough to win, as most viewers gave him the first, second, fourth, and fifth rounds. But the judges went the other way and unanimously scored the contest 48-47 for Machida. Even the initially pro-Lyoto crowd was horrified at the announcement, showering the cage with boos and chanting for Shogun. Controversy followed the decision too, when Judge Cecil Peoples tried to argue that leg kicks don't win fights, even though 2 UFC fights had been stopped by TKO due to that very attack in the 12 months before UFC 104. Thankfully, Dana White agreed with the fans, and an immediate rematch was booked, and Shogun made good of the whole debacle by knocking Machida out in the first round to finally claim the title he should have won 7 months prior. Number 8. BJ Penn versus Frankie Edgar. The bout between BJ Penn and Frankie Edgar at UFC 112 for the lightweight title was expected to be a blowout. The undersized Edgar wasn't considered a credible threat to Penn's crown, having looked solid but unspectacular up until that point. The rounds were extremely close. Penn stalked and landed the heavier shots, while Edgar ducked in and out of range, scoring with combinations.
Ducked under the punch, goes for a takedown. Ooh, he eats a knee.
fastest American to achieve a
Many felt that Edgar was guilty of simply playing for points against the more aggressive Penn. Many expected Penn to retain his title when the fight ended. Instead, it was the answer who came away with the belt. Making matters worse, it was a unanimous decision where only one of the judges even gave Penn 2 rounds. Number 7, Diego Sanchez versus Ross Pearson. This fight isn't just controversial, the judge's decision was straight up robbery. Diego Sanchez faced off against Ross Pearson in his hometown of Albuquerque, and Pearson dominated the fight. Fight metrics don't always tell the story, but they do here. Pearson outstruck Sanchez in every single round, even knocking Sanchez down in the second. Despite all of this, he lost the fight via a split decision. Dana White even said post-fight that the UFC would record the fight as a win for Pearson and went ahead to pay him his win bonus. Number 6, George St. Pierre versus Johnny Hendricks. There was a lot of controversy around longtime UFC welterweight champ George St. Pierre going into his 9th title defense against Johnny Hendricks at UFC 167, with rumors swirling around about a possible retirement. But when the fight was said and done, things only got worse for Rush. He held on to his title with a split decision win that most fans thought should have gone the other way. George St. Pierre was the long-reigning dominant welterweight champion when he faced off against Johnny Hendricks.
He's gonna empty the tank. He understands that he could be gassing a little.
Hendricks seemingly dominated the bout and had St. Pierre's face looking like he went through a wood chipper while waiting for the judge's decision. Regardless, St. Pierre retained the title via a split decision. To make matters worse, St. Pierre declined a rematch against Hendricks and instead opted to take time off from the sport instead. In hindsight, it could be argued that Hendricks attempted to coast the 5th round and thus threw the fight away. But realistically, there's no way he should have ever lost the decision anyway after such a performance. It was one he could never quite live up to, as after winning the vacant title 5 months later, he failed to defend it and has since lost 6 of his 8 subsequent fights. Number 5, Tyron Woodley versus Jake Shields. UFC welterweight champion Tyron Woodley might have a bit of a reputation with the fans as a dull fighter to watch.
Big swing by Woodley. Kim might be hurt. Woodley,
but back in 2013, he was involved in a boring fight that was not his fault in any way. The fight in question, which was a split decision loss to Jake Shields, remains one of the worst robberies in UFC history. Woodley was coming off his UFC debut, and the feeling was that he had the style to beat Shields. Shields had traditionally struggled to defeat opponents he was unable to take down, and Woodley fit that mold completely. Shields never came close to putting Woodley on his back, and although he did manage to gain some clinch control and landed numerous glancing strikes on his opponent, he was also dropped in the first round by a heavy leg kick and stunned badly in the 3rd round by a spinning back fist. Admittedly, Woodley didn't exactly throw strikes with a lot of volume, but when he did land, he clearly made more impact than Shields. And with all other things like the clinching, of which there was a lot, seemed equal, the decision should have gone to Woodley by a score of 30-27. Instead, 2 of the judges went 29-28 for Shields, tipping the scale in his favor with the lone dissenter going 30-27 for Woodley. It was an unearned decision for Shields, while Woodley was clearly robbed of his first victory over a true top-ranked welterweight contender. And because of how relatively uninteresting the fight was, it has been forgotten since, but it remains a truly baffling decision. Number 4, Randy Couture versus Brandon Vera. When the fight was announced as the main event of UFC 105, it was clear that to most fans at least, the main drawing card was Couture. He'd always been pushed as a cult hero by the UFC, and while he'd fallen off the top of the mountain with losses to Brock Lesnar and Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, he was still the betting favorite to beat Vera, who had never quite lived up to the early potential he showed in his early UFC career. But despite most analysts giving Couture a grappling advantage, Vera had a sneakily underrated clinch game, and so when Couture came in looking to impose his usual game plan of dirty boxing from the clinch and takedowns, Vera was ready for him.
Him again here soon.
I think he will.
Which is probably what Brandon wants.
Yeah, and that's why Randy starts moving.
The first round probably went to Couture, as he was the more aggressive of the two, although the clinch exchanges were largely even. But the second round saw Vera dominate, shrugging off Couture's clinch attacks before dropping him with kicks and knees to the body. The third round followed a similar pattern, and this time it was Vera who secured a takedown, moving into a dominant mount position to cement his victory. Only when the judges' scores were read as a unanimous 29-28, it was somehow in favor of Couture, not Vera. Despite chanting for Couture in the early stages of the fight, the British fans showered the cage with boos, recognizing an awful robbery. Vera simply slumped on the steps leading up to the octagon, shaking his head in disbelief. This fight remains one of the worst decisions in UFC simply because, in some of the other bad calls, the winning fighter at least did some damage. Unlike this fight, it appeared that the judges had given Couture the win simply due to his ability to secure a largely neutral position. It was baffling at the time, and it remains so to hardcore fans today. Number 3. Sean Sherk versus Evan Dunham. It isn't very often that a fighter comes close to finishing their opponent with both strikes and submission attempts and still manages to lose the decision. But that's exactly what happened to Evan Dunham when he fought former UFC lightweight champion Sean Sherk at UFC 119 in September 2010. Dunham was coming into the fight off the back of 11 straight wins, 4 in the UFC, and it looked like he'd follow it up with his 12th when he caught Sherk in a tight guillotine choke in the first round. Even commentator Mike Goldberg figured he'd won as he began to yell his trademark "It is all over" line before Sherk was turning purple, somehow escaped and then sliced Dunham open with an elbow, causing blood to spurt from a nasty cut.
There with that elbow, that's what cut him. Let's take a look at it one more time. Sharp elbow of Sean Sherk.
The elbow could have been seen to have won Sherk the round, but the second and third went to Dunham. He came close to choking Sherk out in the second with another 2 guillotine chokes, and then almost had the former champ knocked out in the third with a nasty high kick. At worst, it should have been a 29-28 victory for Dunham, but instead, 2 of the judges saw it as a 29-28 win for Sherk, disgusting the crowd. But thankfully, the UFC appeared to recognize that Dunham had been robbed and treated him as if he'd won the fight, as he was given the main event slot against Melvin Gillard in his next fight. Sherk, meanwhile, retired in 2013 after a myriad of injuries and never fought again. Sherk ended his career with a win rather than the loss he should have received. Number 2. John Jones versus Dominic Reyes. John Jones' fight with Dominic Reyes was a downright robbery. Reyes took the fight to Jones from the word go, with him cleanly taking the first 3 rounds in most fans' eyes. The last 2 rounds were closer, but seemingly everyone on the planet thought there would be a new champion when the judges' scorecards were announced at UFC 247. Despite this, Jones took another unanimous decision victory to retain. While some may argue that Jones should be granted the champion's advantage, which isn't an actual thing, the fact is that Reyes won the first 3 rounds convincingly in the striking department.
A good left shot by Reyes. Look at this one. Left hand on the chin. And another one.
Which is supposed to be the first criteria considered under the unified rules. Had Jones managed a submission attempt or any ground and pound during the contest, this would be a different story. As it is, the stand-up striking was the most significant element of the fight, and Reyes had the advantage on the feet in 3 of the 5 rounds. This is to take nothing away from Jones, who showed off his durable chin and timely defense to avoid becoming one of Reyes' knockout victims. And he also outperformed Reyes in the final 2 rounds, but Reyes did enough to win. Number 1. Sean O'Malley versus Petr Yan. At the number 1 spot, we have a more recent fight, a fight that took place in the Etihad Arena in Abu Dhabi, a bantamweight matchup between former champion Petr Yan and rising contender Sean O'Malley. This bout certainly did not lack action from beginning to end, meeting expectations of a bout between top names in the UFC's bantamweight division. After 15 minutes, the judges were split, with 2 scoring the contest in favor of O'Malley. However, the unofficial judges watching at home were not split at all. All 26 media scores submitted to MMA Decisions scored the bout for Yan. 7 of those scores did not find a single round for O'Malley. Official judges Ben Cartledge and David Letheby turned in 29-28 scores for O'Malley, while the dissenting judge, Vito Paolillo, issued a 29-28 in Jan's favor. The judges differed on round 1, leading to the split decision result. UFC president Dana White didn't seem very convinced with O'Malley's win, as he stated that the judges scored the contest completely different from how he thought the fight played out. He said it was one of those razor-thin close fights. He could see people saying Jan won the fight, and he could see people saying O'Malley won the fight. But what's weird was that it wasn't the way he thought it was with the judges' scorecard. He thought depending on who they gave the first round to determined who won the fight. But apparently, that wasn't the case. Another tough loss for Jan. He should be calling for an immediate rematch for 5 rounds instead of 3. What do you think about the fighters in this video? Do you know any other more unsettling judges' decisions that should have made it here? Let us know in the comment section below. Subscribe for more MMA content.